In music we have something called tonality. There has been movements in the last century to abolish tonality, and that does have its place in music, but in my humble opinion, we hear music, we reference music according to tonal centers. So even if you have something that aspires to be atonal music, still the way we perceive it is towards possibly shifting centers of tonality, but nothing is free of gravity. And gravity is really the way I see the use of the forces that we have within music, the way we use music. Now, very popular in the field of teaching music today is to use scales and then give these scales certain names. And that has its validity and it has its points, but really it doesn't go anywhere to explain what music does, what music is. It just tells you that you have a certain amount of notes, you have a certain note content. Now, if I would, for instance, let's get this in a key that makes any sense here. If I would say, for instance, I would play a D minor 7, a D minor 7, a G7, and then a C major 7. That's a very common chord progression in jazz. It's what they call the 2-5-1 progression. If you read a book from one of the pop, jazz, rock schools of today, they would tell you that the first chord you play a D Dorian, on the second chord, on the 7th chord, you would play a G Mixolydian, and then basically you end up in C major. But the point here is all those scales have the same content. It's just bloody C major. It's nothing other than that. But really what happens here is this tonal content in this scale, in these chords, kind of sets of different gravitational forces towards the tonal center, which you see. So basically what we have is the tonality of C major. But what happens here is this chord creates a certain derivation and gravitational force away from the tonic chord, from the center chord. And of course, the G7 even more so. And you can go into the classical theory and talk about functional harmony, and you say that yes, this first chord is what they call a subdominant parallel. It's the parallel chord to the subdominant in that key, and of course the 7th chord is a dominant chord. That's one way of explaining it. But even so, what is really more important here is that the individual notes have a gravitational force in relation to the tonal center. And if you start to think about it in this way, all 12 chromatic notes that we recognize in the Western system of music, there are more notes if you go to other parts of the world, but that's another discussion. They all have their specific relation with the tonal center of C. So if you take it very simple, you have C, and then you have a C major scale. So the D has a certain kind of relation. The E has another. All of them have. But also, even if you're in the scale of C, the notes that are not in the scale have this relation too. It's like that was of course a D flat, which is normally not in the tonality or scale of C major, but it has a relationship in that scale. Or you can take an F sharp, for instance. Has that relationship, or it and of course when you play a chord in any key, you temporarily move the tonal center somewhere else. So what happens here is you play a D minor 7. You have moved the tonal center to D. But C is still the tonal center in our minds, in our memory. So you deal with two. So if I play in this here, I just pick one note. I pick an F, for instance. At this chord, in this particular moment in time in the song, this note has a relationship with this chord, of course. It's the third, minor third of this chord. But it also has a relationship to the original tonic. So what you're doing is you're hearing three different forces going at the same time. And really, what music is, what creating music is balancing these forces. So it has to do with the it's like a solar system of notes. Like you have gravitational forces that keeps everything in place, and that is what you play with when you play with music. So understanding the notes and the scales is one thing, but it doesn't tell you the whole story. And really the whole story is, what does every note have to do with the chord and with the tonality you're playing in? Because you can include any note you want. Any of the 12 chromatic notes can be included and played at any point. But what you have to understand is what does this note do to your emotions, to your senses, and how do you figure this out? Experimentation, trying it, and of course we hear logic in sound, and if there is a logic movement, we will perceive it as music. And so if you put a logical pattern in a non-tonal way into tonal music, it will do something that we will recognize and we will be moved by it. Basically what I'm saying with this, that if you take, for instance, a non-tonal or non-diatonic scale sort of grouping of sounds and put it in a tonal environment, it will still sound like music to us. For instance, there's a very common scale which is called sometimes the diminished scale or half whole tone scale, which is basically you go one half step and then one whole step. So for instance, you come to this point of the 7th chord and you go first on the D minor, you play just the C major basically, then you come to the G7, then you can go and that's basically just whole and half step. That's a very simple thing because it goes very well over the G7 and it's not anything fantastic and unique. But what is good to think about when you do it is that the reason why we perceive it as being a pleasant sound or whatever is because there is an inherent logic, and we intuitively recognize that with our ears. Basically, you could say in a way that we hear mathematics with our ears. And we have an intuitive way of understanding mathematics just by listening. That is sound. Now the little introduction piece I played is a Indian rag. What it's called is irrelevant here. But what is interesting about it, if you listen now to that thing again, is that, of course, in Indian music, you have this drone going, which is basically the root and the fifth of whatever scale it is that you're playing. But with Indian music, you have freed yourself from the diatonic scale. And the diatonic scale, of course, is, as we know, the major and minor scales in Western music. And it's a certain grouping of notes where it basically goes whole step, half step, whole step, half step, like the C major is whole step, half step, whole step, what I'm saying, no, then another whole step again, and then half step. So you have a diatonic scale, and that is basically constructed of two what's called tetrachords, which is basically construction that is whole step, half step, separated by a whole step. So if you have a C major scale, you have, which is whole step, half step, and you reach the F, and then you go up to the G, and then you have from the G, again, whole step, half step. Now in Indian music, you are freed from this slavery to this particular pattern, and you use sometimes constructions that are quite different for us as Westerners. For instance, this raga that I was playing goes like this. You have the tonal center is E, and it's half step, and then a minor third. And the next one is then is a whole step to the next part of the scale, which is the same pattern again. It's half step, and then a minor third, and then you're up to the tonal center again, the E. So basically, but it's perfectly great as a melodic instrument to create beautiful music with. And basically what I was showing here in this introduction thing is just how this gravitational thing works that I'm talking about. It's easier in Indian music because you have the gravitational center clearly pointed out by the drone that lies on these notes in the background. So if I now in this introduce the first scale note, or the first step in the music here, the F, it's very easy to hear how it wants to drag back to the center of gravity. And even if I go another step away, I create even more drag back to this. And if I go up to the third scale note, you get sort of a new plateau that you can sit on a little bit, but not for too long, until it wants to go back, right? And to do a little research into Indian music, for me, is very useful if you want to understand how Western tonality works. Because if you sit and just play, you get the drone box, or you just play one note and see how does these different notes that we're using relate to the tonal center. And when you get that instinctive knowledge in your mind, that's when you can start to paint. That's when you can start to paint with music. Another way of doing this is you sit down at the piano and you hit the center of gravity, the tonal center, maybe supported by the fifth in your left hand, and you just try these other notes with your right hand, and you will get a sense of it.